first coat mud. Most guys like to use a 10-inch knife. I always stick to my 12-inch knife. Strike in the tape. That just gets the mud in the grooves. Strike it in. Strike it in. Strike it in. Almost like a pre-fill technique. That mud gets pushed inside the grooves of the fiberglass. Now you can coat the area. I'm going to coat this whole area since it's down by the baseboard to the angle. I'm just going to coat this whole area out. One big patch. That way it blends in. This is a quick set mud, so I gotta work fast with it. I want to get the mud on, coated, and I want all the mud out of my pan cleaned up before it starts setting up. Of course, if this was a joint compound, you'd coat it and just let this sit overnight. Then you'd have to turn around and sand it the next day. I'm using a 5-minute mud, more professional grade material. You never mudded before, never picked up a pan and knife, do not use hot muds. Just use a joint compound. Hot muds, mix a little more than I need, but get it all out of your pan. Go wash out your pans and knives while that's setting up. Next up, we're going to come in here as it's setting up. It's 5 minutes, so I'm going to come back in here in about 5 to 7 minutes. Once it's not wet no more, I'm going to sponge it and slick it out with a damp sponge. And
still kind of damp. Sponge, damp, wet sponge, nice straight, clean 6-inch knife. Get rid of the edges. Get rid of the edges first. I went against the wall into the angle. So now we have to only get rid of this edge. Since I went down to the baseboard and to the angle. Take your 6-inch knife, sponge, I kind of go over it with the sponge. This is hot mud technique only. This is not a joint compound technique. Hot mud. 5 minutes, 20 minutes, 40 minute, 90 minute. This is how you work with these hot muds. This is more of a pro grade material. I'm just taking off the extra mud. To do a slick out technique correctly, you can almost treat it like you're doing a second coat or a third coat. Like that. Took off the extra mud. Feathered in that edge. You want to feather in the edge on spray textures. Most textures you always want to feather in the edge. Right now I could probably turn around and texture it and it'd be good, but I'm going to go mix up a little bit more 5-minute mud and I'm going to do a really tight skim coat over this. The second coat, if you do a first coat correctly and it's sanded or slicked out good, your second coat's just a fill-in, to fill in any chatters, goobers, imperfections. But your first coat should do your majority of your coating. You can slick out any direction. You're just taking off the extra materials, getting rid of lap marks, stuff like that. So I'm going to go mix another bit of mud. While I'm mixing that mud, this will set up. Alright, a little more. So let's go ahead and get a second coat. Mud's a little thinner than your first coat. Every coat you do is going to be a tad bit thinner than the prior coat. So we're just doing a tight skim, so it doesn't need to be heavy, thick mud. Using my 12-inch knife, and I'm just going over everything again. Tight skim coat. If the patch was ugly and deep still, you'd leave the mud on just a little bit thicker. But this patch looks perfect as is. I'm just doing a tight coat. Tight coat. Slick coat. You can also go the opposite direction of your first coat. A lot of guys like to do that. They swear by that. But this one just needs to go this direction, doesn't matter. Alright, same thing, let that set up. Clean the mud out of this pan. It is a quick set mud, so I gotta clean it all up. Clean my tools. You don't want this stuff to dry on your tools. It'll set up like a cement in your tools, and it'll ruin your tools or be a lot of extra work trying to scrape all that dried, set up mud in there. So go clean your tools. While you're cleaning your tools, this will start setting up. Then you can prepare for the next process. The next process on this, I'm going to slick it out again. And then it's a spray texture, so I need the spray hopper, air compressor, the hose, and then I'm going to use a joint compound for the texture. So I got to get all that ready. So there's plenty of steps here while this is setting up.
Second coat,
so I'm getting everything ready. This will really set up
the first coat. Got to slick it out.
Clean 6-inch knife, damp sponge, get rid of the edges. That's the most important thing, is feathering that edge. Feather the edge. The angle down to the baseboard. You go the opposite direction even of your coat. Don't feel any chatters the opposite direction. Real tight against the baseboard. We don't want a big clump of mud against the baseboard, so make sure your baseboard's feathered in really tight. All that extra mud I'm taking off. Look at that. All that extra mud. Sometimes you just need enough mud to coat it. You don't need to just put a big old mud hump on the wall, big patch. Nice tight coats. That's what the tight coat, and I'm still taking mud off. The mud's going where it needs to go. Everything looks good. Some guys even like to chip out down by the baseboard, make sure it's real tight, so when you pull your masking tape, it doesn't mess up your texture, because you clumped up the mud on the bottom. Check your angles, check your edges, check your base area. Let that set up another couple minutes. And then I'm going to get this spray hopper. I'm going to spray this with a spray knockdown. I'm using a middle tip for my spray hopper. That's for like a splatter, heavy orange peel. Most hoppers have 3 tips. I always use the middle tips, the go-to. Using an all-purpose joint compound, thinned down like a heavy pancake batter consistency. Well, let's go ahead and let this set up a few more minutes. In the meantime,
my
get
hopper
your air
ready.
compressor and texture tools
Middle
ready.
tip.
Adjustment. It's down here. I'm using my little air compressor, so this one kind of runs out of air quickly. The reason I'm using the little ones because I'm upstairs and I'm just doing a little patch, so I don't want to bring my big 60-pound compressor up the stairs. So I may have to spray this a little bit and then let the air compressor get more air in the tank and then spray it again. But let's go ahead. It's going to get noisy because the air compressor is loud and it takes forever to fill up because it's my little air compressor for doing these small patches. It actually did pretty good for that small patch. Knockdown. A lot of guys like to let their mud set up, knock down. That's fine. If you're doing patches in the summer, it's really hot, you don't want to let them set up because they'll drag when you go to knock them down. But knockdown, I use a straight 6-inch knife, clean, damp. 6-inch knife is easier to use than a big knife, especially for patchwork. If you're doing a whole ceiling, whole wall, yeah, you'd use a bigger knife. But for patchwork, I'm not pushing down. I'm literally gliding the knife. I'm barely even holding the knife. Look. So this just takes experience of doing this, lightly knocking it down. The knife's just gliding over the surface. If you put any pressure on this, you're going to cause flat spots, which you don't want. Lightly knock it down. trick here is I always keep a damp sponge. I keep my 6 clean. Sometimes just that layer of moisture on that 6 helps it glide across that texture easier. I've seen guys, they just go all day and they don't even wipe down, clean their knockdown knives. But I always have a sponge in my hand when I do knockdowns. You're not getting crazy with the knockdown. If you miss some areas, that's fine. You're going to have to sand this before you paint it. So any missed areas will get sanded down to give you that knockdown appearance. Sometimes over knockdown will make the job worse because this stuff's going to shrink back a little bit. So you want to leave it a little heavier than the existing if possible because it's going to shrink back. Sponge. Some guys like to sponge the edge. Just the overspray little dots. You don't have to do this because when you sand it the next day or when you sand it, they'll get rid of those dots. Remember how I said on the baseboard, you pull it tight because when you pull this masking tape here, if you left a clump of mud down there, you'd pull all that mud, and that was a perfect masking removal. Same thing here on the wall. Perfect. So now I'm just pulling my masking. It don't get any better than that. Next step, let it dry for 24 hours. Be careful, it is wet to touch. Next day, lightly sand it. Lightly sand it. A little more effort on the edge. Just glide over it. If this was a sandpaper, I'd just go over it real easy. Easy swipes, a little more effort on the edge to transition the new texture into the old texture. Then primer, then paint. You could take your paint match in the meantime while this is drying. You go get your new paint, get your sanding block or 150 grit sandpaper, primer, then paint. You'll be ready to go. But let this dry. Also masking. Everybody wants to leave the masking up because they know they're going to paint the next day, but just pull your masking because we got texture all over the masking, and sometimes if you let this texture dry and then you pull the masking the next day, that mud is dried on there and you'll pull the mud off the wall. So always pull your masking. Just remask if you're going to paint the next day. But paint sample, it's all textured with spray knockdown. Pretty easy patch. It's just a tight area around the toilet, so those are always fun. So that was the only hard thing here. That's pretty good to go. Then they can put their toilet paper holder back. I recommend they do that after they primer and paint. Good to go. Hope you like this video. We also have other videos on the channel, playlists, drywall repairs, patching, stress cracks, easy do-it-yourself type repairs. So if you haven't done it already, please subscribe, please like, and please comment. And jump into my other videos and do the same. Hey, thanks for viewing, thanks for subscribing.